The gunshot echoed across the Texas plains as Victoria Newman fell from her horse, blood seeping through her riding dress, staining the parched earth beneath her. The outlaws who ambushed her laughed, the harsh sound carrying on the hot wind as they rifled through her saddlebags, taking everything of value before disappearing into the distance, leaving her for dead as the merciless summer sun beat down upon her unconscious form. It was pure chance that brought Blake Reynolds to that lonely stretch of terrain outside San Elizario, Texas, in the summer of 1877. The 30-year-old cowboy had been tracking a stray from his herd when he spotted the fallen horse and the crumpled figure beside it. At first, he thought she was already dead, another unfortunate victim of the lawless frontier, but as he dismounted and knelt beside her, he saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest. "Madam, madam, can you hear me?" Blake touched her shoulder gently, his weathered face creased with concern. He received no response. Blood had soaked through her clothing at the shoulder and hip, and a nasty gash marred her forehead. Her fair skin was already reddening from exposure to the sun, and Blake knew that even if the bullet wounds didn't kill her, the heat surely would if he didn't act quickly. With practiced ease, he gathered the unconscious woman into his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her tall frame. Her chestnut hair tumbled down in disarray, partially obscuring a face that, even streaked with dirt and blood, was strikingly beautiful. Blake pushed that thought aside as he carefully lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her, securing her against his chest. "Hold on, miss," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "I'll get you somewhere safe." His ranch was closer than town, and Blake made the decision instantly. He wouldn't risk the jostling ride to San Elizario, not with her wounds bleeding freely. Turning his horse toward home, he rode as swiftly as he dared, one arm wrapped firmly around the stranger's waist to keep her from falling. Blake's ranch, the Sundown, wasn't large by Texas standards, just enough land to run a modest herd of cattle with a small but sturdy two-bedroom house he'd built himself. As he approached the weathered wooden structure, he called out to his ranch hand, Hank, get out here." The door swung open, and an older man with a silver-streaked beard appeared, his eyes widening at the sight of Blake and his wounded companion. "Good Lord, what happened?" Hank hurried forward as Blake carefully dismounted, still holding the woman in his arms, found her about 5 miles out. "Looks like outlaws. Shot twice that I can see and been left in the sun who knows how long. Get my medical supplies and heat some water." As Hank rushed to follow orders, Blake carried the woman inside, laying her gently on his own bed. Her riding dress was made of quality material, though now torn and bloodied. Whoever she was, she came from money. That made her an even more likely target for the bandits who plagued the territory. Blake worked quickly, gathering clean cloths and cutting away the fabric around her wounds. The bullet in her shoulder appeared to have gone clean through, but the one in her hip was more troubling. He'd have to dig that one out. "Here's everything," Hank said, returning with Blake's medical kit and a kettle of hot water. The older man hovered in the doorway, twisting his hat in his hands. "You need help," Blake shook his head. "Best if you ride into town, fetch Doc Miller if he's sober, and send word to the sheriff about what happened." "You sure you can handle this?" Hank asked, eyeing the unconscious woman with concern. "Not the first bullet I've dug out," Blake replied grimly. "During the war, I helped field surgeons when they were overwhelmed. I know what I'm doing." After Hank departed, Blake turned his full attention to his patient. He cleaned the blood from her face first, revealing high cheekbones and full lips that were dry and cracked from dehydration. Gently, he tipped a few drops of water between her lips, relieved when she swallowed reflexively. "That's it," he murmured encouragingly. "You're going to be all right." The next hours were a grueling test of Blake's skill and patience. He extracted the bullet from her hip with steady hands, cleaned both wounds thoroughly, and stitched them closed with the neat, precise stitches he'd learned during his time in the war. Throughout the ordeal, she remained mercifully unconscious, only occasionally letting out small whimpers of pain that twisted something in Blake's chest. By the time he'd bandaged her wounds, cleaned the gash on her forehead, and changed her into one of his clean shirts to preserve her modesty, night had fallen. Blake sat in a chair beside the bed, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest, wondering who she was and what circumstances had brought her to that lonely stretch of road. "Who are you?" he asked softly in the dim lamplight. "And what am I supposed to do with you now?" As if in answer, the woman's eyelids fluttered, and for a brief moment she opened her eyes, a striking shade of green that pierced through Blake unexpectedly. Her lips parted as if to speak, but then her eyes closed again, and she slipped back into unconsciousness. Blake rubbed his face wearily. It would be a long night of watching and waiting. He settled more comfortably in the chair, prepared to keep vigil until morning. The fever took her just before dawn. Blake woke from a light doze to find her thrashing weakly against the sheets, her skin burning to the touch. He worked tirelessly, applying cool cloths to her forehead, neck, and wrists, murmuring reassurances she couldn't hear. "Fight," he told her as he wrung out another cloth. "You've made it this far, don't give up now." When Hank returned mid-morning, it was without the doctor. "Doc's away delivering twins up at the Henderson place," he reported. "Sheriff's sending men to look for the Outlaws, but he needs a description." Blake glanced at the woman, who was still caught in fever's grip. "She can't tell us anything yet, and I didn't see them myself." Hank nodded, then looked around the room. "Found anything to tell us who she is?" "Nothing. Her saddlebags were emptied and there was no identification on her." Blake dipped another cloth in the basin of cool water. "Could you check on her horse?" "I left it where I found her, but it might have wandered back this way." "Already did. Found a bay mare about 2 miles from here, still saddled. No markings or brand I recognized. Brought her back to the stable." "Thanks, Hank." Blake placed the fresh cloth on the woman's forehead. "I need you to take over the ranch work today. I can't leave her like this." For the next 3 days, Blake hardly left her side, sleeping in short bursts when exhaustion overtook him. The fever raged, breaking briefly only to return with greater intensity. He spooned broth and water between her lips whenever possible, changed her bandages regularly, and spoke to her constantly, believing somehow that his voice might tether her to life. On the 4th morning, Blake woke to find a pair of green eyes watching him from the bed. "Who are you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from disuse. Blake straightened immediately, relief flooding through him. "Blake Reynolds, madam. I found you after you were attacked. You're at my ranch about 10 miles outside San Elizario." She tried to sit up and winced in pain, falling back against the pillows. "Easy now," Blake cautioned, pouring a glass of water. "You've been shot twice and had a terrible fever. Here, drink this slowly." He helped her lift her head, holding the glass to her lips. She drank gratefully, then rested back, her eyes never leaving his face. "Thank you," she said, her voice slightly stronger. "I'm Victoria Newman. I was traveling to El Paso when those men attacked me." Her brow furrowed as she tried to remember. There were 3 of them. "They wanted my money and jewelry, but then one recognized me." She trailed off, confusion evident in her expression. "Recognized you?" Blake prompted gently. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "He said something about my father, that this would teach him a lesson." She opened her eyes again, looking troubled. "My father is Emmett Newman. He owns the largest cattle operation in the El Paso territory." Blake nodded slowly. The Newman name was well known throughout western Texas. Emmett Newman had built an empire from nothing and was as respected as he was feared. There were rumors he'd made enemies during his rise to power. "Sounds like you were targeted deliberately," Blake said. "Not just a random robbery." Victoria tried to move again and gasped as pain shot through her hip. "How bad is it?" she asked, her voice tight. "The shoulder wound was clean, went straight through. The one in your hip was deeper. I had to remove the bullet myself." Blake hesitated. "I'm sorry for the impropriety, but there was no one else to help at the time." A faint blush colored Victoria's pale cheeks. "You saved my life, Mr. Reynolds. I think we can forgive the impropriety." Her green eyes held his for a moment longer than necessary before she looked away. "My father will reward you handsomely for your assistance." Something in her tone made Blake frown slightly. "I don't want a reward, Miss Newman. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said softly. "They wouldn't have. Most would have left me to die or taken advantage." She studied him with renewed interest. "You're an unusual man, Mr. Reynolds." Before Blake could respond, the door opened, and Hank appeared with a tray of food. His weathered face broke into a smile when he saw Victoria awake. Well now, look who's decided to rejoin the land of the living. Blake here hasn't slept more than an hour at a stretch since he brought you in. Blake shot Hank a warning glance, but Victoria had already turned her attention back to him, surprise evident on her face. You've been caring for me all this time. Someone had to, Blake said simply, standing and taking the tray from Hank. You need to eat something. It's just broth and biscuits for now until we're sure your stomach can handle it. As Blake helped Victoria eat, Hank filled her in on how they'd found her horse and sent word to the sheriff about the attack. Victoria listened attentively, though Blake could see fatigue rapidly overtaking her. We should send word to your father, Blake said as he took the half-empty bowl from her. He must be worried sick about you. Victoria's expression grew troubled. Yes, I suppose so, though I wasn't expected for another week. I left our ranch in Austin early. She didn't elaborate further and Blake didn't press. Rest now, he said, seeing her eyelids growing heavy. We can sort everything out once you've regained some strength. Victoria didn't argue, her eyes already closing. Within moments, she was asleep again, though this time her rest seemed more natural and peaceful. She's a pretty one, Hank remarked quietly as they left the room. And a Newman to boot. That family's got more money than God. Blake shot him a warning look. She's a wounded woman who needed help. That's all. Sure, boss, Hank replied with a knowing smirk that Blake chose to ignore. Over the next few days, Victoria's condition improved steadily. Her fever remained at bay, and she was able to stay awake for longer periods, even managing to sit up with Blake's assistance. They fell into a routine of sorts. Blake would bring her meals and check her bandages, and they would talk. Despite his initial determination to maintain a professional distance, Blake found himself looking forward to these conversations more than he cared to admit. Victoria, he discovered, was nothing like he'd expected from the daughter of a cattle baron. She was educated and well-spoken, yes, but there was a refreshing directness to her that contrasted sharply with the affected manners of most society women he'd encountered. She had opinions, strong ones, on everything from cattle breeding to politics, and she didn't hesitate to share them. My father says I was born arguing, she told Blake on the 5th evening as he changed the bandage on her shoulder. My mother died when I was 8, and I think he never quite figured out what to do with a daughter who preferred riding and ranch work to needlepoint and piano lessons. Blake smiled at the mental image of a young Victoria trailing after ranch hands, asking endless questions. He must be proud of you, though. Something flickered in Victoria's eyes. Sometimes, when I'm not being obstinate and unreasonable, as he puts it. She winced slightly as Blake's fingers brushed against the healing wound. He wants me to marry Richard Collins. That's why I was heading to El Paso early, to avoid another discussion about the engagement. Blake's hands paused momentarily before continuing their work. Collins, the banker's son, Victoria nodded. The very same. Father says it's a perfect match. The Newman cattle and the Collins money would create quite the empire. And what do you say? Blake asked, carefully securing the fresh bandage. Victoria's gaze met his directly. I say I'd rather spend my life with someone I respect and care for, not someone chosen for business advantages. Blake found himself unable to look away from her intense green eyes. That seems reasonable enough to me. Not to my father. He built everything from nothing and can't understand why I wouldn't want to continue expanding the family legacy. She sighed. I'm grateful for all he's done, truly. But I want my own life. Blake finished with the bandage and stepped back, suddenly aware of how intimate their conversation had become. Your hip wound is healing well, he said, changing the subject. I think you might be able to try standing tomorrow with support. Victoria seemed to sense his withdrawal and nodded, her expression becoming more guarded. Thank you. I don't want to be a burden any longer than necessary. You're not a burden, Blake said quickly, then cleared his throat. I mean, you're welcome to stay as long as needed for your recovery. A small smile touched Victoria's lips. That's very kind of you, Mr. Reynolds. Blake, he corrected her. After all we've been through, I think you can call me Blake. Only if you'll call me Victoria, she replied, her smile widening slightly. Victoria, he said, testing the name. It suited her, elegant but strong. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging if you're going to try walking. As Blake left the room, he found himself troubled by the direction of his thoughts. Victoria Newman was as far above his station as the stars were above the earth. She was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Texas, temporarily in his care due to circumstance, nothing more. The strange pull he felt toward her was inappropriate and futile. Yet that night, as he tried to sleep on the makeshift pallet in the main room of his house, he couldn't stop thinking about the way her eyes lit up when she spoke passionately, or how her smile transformed her entire face from merely beautiful to breathtaking. "Don't be a fool, Reynolds," he muttered to himself in the darkness. "She'll be gone as soon as she's well enough, back to her world of wealth and privilege." But even as he said the words, Blake knew he was already in danger of losing his heart to Victoria Newman. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect summer day that made the harshness of Texas seem worth it. Blake had been up since before sunrise, completing his ranch chores with unusual efficiency, driven by the anticipation of helping Victoria take her first steps since the attack. When he entered the bedroom with a breakfast tray, he found her already sitting up, her hair neatly braided over one shoulder. Someone, probably Mrs. Garcia, the Mexican woman who came to help with washing, had found her a simple dress to replace Blake's oversized shirt. "Good morning," Victoria greeted him, her eyes bright with determination. "I'm ready to try walking today." Blake set the tray down beside her. "Breakfast first, you'll need your strength." She ate with more appetite than she'd shown previously, another encouraging sign of her recovery. When she'd finished, Blake stood beside the bed, offering his arm for support. "Take it slowly," he cautioned. "You haven't used your muscles in almost a week." Victoria nodded, then carefully swung her legs over the edge of the bed. With a deep breath, she gripped Blake's forearm and slowly stood. Pain flashed across her face, but she bit her lip and remained upright, leaning heavily against him. "How does it feel?" Blake asked, his arm steady around her waist. "Like I've been trampled by a herd of cattle," she admitted with a grimace that transformed into a determined smile. "But I'm standing." "That you are," Blake agreed, surprised by the rush of pride he felt. "Want to try a few steps?" Victoria nodded, and together they moved slowly across the room. Each step was clearly painful for her, but she refused to give up, her jaw set in a stubborn line that Blake was beginning to recognize. When they reached the window, she paused, looking out at the sundown ranch for the first time. "It's beautiful," she said softly, taking in the vista of rolling grassland dotted with cattle, the distant mountains shimmering in the morning heat. "How long have you had this place?" "5 years," Blake replied, acutely aware of her warmth against his side. "Bought it after the war with money I'd saved from working cattle drives." "You built it yourself," Victoria observed, not a question but a statement. Blake nodded. "Every board and nail. It's not much compared to what you're used to." "No," she interrupted him. "It's perfect because it's yours. You made it with your own hands." She turned to look up at him, her face close enough that he could see flecks of gold in her green eyes. "That's worth more than all my father's holdings." For a moment, Blake couldn't speak, caught in her gaze and the sincerity of her words. Then he cleared his throat. "We should get you back to bed before you overtire yourself." The journey back seemed longer, Victoria leaning more heavily on him with each step. By the time she sank back onto the bed, her face was pale with exhaustion and pain, but her eyes shone with triumph. "Tomorrow," she declared, "I want to go outside." Blake laughed despite himself. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Victoria Newman, so I've been told," she replied with a tired smile. "Usually not as a compliment." "It was meant as one," Blake assured her. "Rest now. I need to check the herd." As he turned to leave, Victoria caught his hand. Her touch was light, but it stopped him as effectively as a lasso. "Thank you, Blake," she said softly. "Not just for this, but for everything. I know you've put your life on hold to care for me." Blake looked down at their joined hands, her slim fingers pale against his sun-darkened skin. "I haven't minded," he said truthfully. Then, before he could say something he might regret, he gently disentangled his hand and left the room. Outside, Blake took a deep breath of the fresh air, trying to clear his head. This wouldn't do. He was developing feelings for a woman who would leave as soon as she was well enough, returning to a life where someone like him had no place. The sooner she recovered fully, the better for both of them. Yet even as he thought it, Blake knew he was lying to himself. The prospect of Victoria leaving created an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with the heart. The next week established a new routine. Each morning, Blake would help Victoria walk a little farther, first around the house, then onto the porch, and finally short distances around the yard. Her strength returned rapidly, though the wound in her hip still pained her and would likely leave her with a slight limp, at least temporarily. During these walks, they talked about everything and nothing: his time in the Confederate cavalry during the war, her childhood on the Newman ranch, books they'd read, dreams they harbored. Blake found himself sharing thoughts he'd never voiced to anyone, drawn out by Victoria's genuine interest and thoughtful responses. In the afternoons, while Blake tended to ranch business, Victoria would sit on the porch, reading books from Blake's modest collection or simply watching the activities of the ranch with keen interest. Sometimes Hank would keep her company, entertaining her with stories from his colorful past that made her laugh, a sound Blake found increasingly precious. On the 10th day after she'd regained consciousness, Blake returned from checking fence lines to find Victoria in the kitchen, her hair tied back with a ribbon, attempting to prepare supper alongside Mrs. Garcia. "What are you doing?" he asked, surprised to see her on her feet for so long. Victoria looked up, a streak of flour across one cheek. "Learning to make tortillas," she answered with a grin. "Mrs. Garcia says mine are terrible, but I'm determined to master them before I leave." The casual mention of her departure sent an unexpected pang through Blake. He'd been so focused on her recovery, on the day-to-day pleasure of her company, that he'd almost managed to forget she would eventually return to her own world. "Blake," Victoria's smile faded as she studied his expression. "Is everything all right?" He forced a smile. "Just tired." The north fence line had more damage than I expected. Mrs. Garcia, a perceptive woman who had been watching their interactions with knowing eyes, suddenly announced she needed to fetch something from the storeroom, leaving them alone. Victoria wiped her hands on her apron, one of Mrs. Garcia's, far too large for her slender frame, and approached Blake. "You're working too hard, trying to maintain the ranch while taking care of me. I'm sorry to be such a burden." "You're not," Blake said automatically, though in truth the ranch work had fallen behind. It was worth it, though, for these days with her. Victoria looked at him searchingly. "I should write to my father, let him know what happened. He can send men to escort me to El Paso when I'm well enough to travel." The thought of Victoria leaving with Newman's men, returning to her father's plans for her future, filled Blake with an irrational desire to ask her to stay. Instead, he nodded stiffly. "Of course, I'll arrange for a letter to be delivered." Victoria's eyes never left his face. "Unless," Blake repeated when she didn't continue. "Unless there's a reason I should stay longer." Her voice was quiet, tentative in a way he'd never heard from her before. Blake's heart hammered in his chest. Was she suggesting what he thought? No, it couldn't be. A woman like Victoria Newman didn't contemplate remaining in a modest ranch house with a man of his humble standing. "Your father will be worried," he said finally, taking the safe path. "And you'll heal better with proper medical attention." Something like disappointment flickered in Victoria's eyes before she nodded. "Of course, you're right." She turned back to the table, her shoulders straight but tense. "I'll write the letter this evening." That night, after a quiet supper where conversation had been stilted despite Hank's efforts to fill the silence, Blake sat on the porch steps, staring at the star-filled Texas sky. The letter Victoria had written lay beside him, sealed and ready to be sent to El Paso with Hank in the morning. The door opened behind him, and he knew without looking that it was Victoria. She walked with only a slight limp now, remarkable progress in such a short time. "May I join you?" she asked softly. Blake nodded, moving over slightly to make room for her on the step. She sat carefully, arranging her skirts around her. "It's beautiful out here at night," she observed after a moment of silence. "In Austin, you can't see half as many stars because of the city lights." "One of the reasons I chose this place," Blake replied. "Sometimes I sit out here for hours, just looking up." Victoria followed his gaze to the heavens. "What do you think about during those hours?" Blake considered the question. The past sometimes, choices I've made, paths not taken. Mostly the future, though what I want to build here, the legacy I might leave. Do you want a family? Victoria asked, her voice carefully neutral. The question caught Blake off guard. I did once, before the war. He hadn't talked about this with anyone in years. I was engaged to a girl from my hometown, Martha. She was sweet, kind. While I was fighting, she took ill with fever, didn't make it. Victoria's hand found his in the darkness. I'm sorry, Blake, he shrugged, though the gesture belied the old pain that still lingered. It was a long time ago. After, I didn't think much about family anymore, focused on building this place instead. And now, Victoria's question hung in the air between them, laden with meaning Blake was afraid to interpret. He turned to look at her, her face silvered by moonlight, more beautiful than any woman had a right to be. Now I'm not sure what I want, he admitted. Everything seems less certain than it did a few weeks ago. Victoria's eyes met his, and in them, Blake saw a vulnerability that matched his own. I know what you mean, she said softly. Meeting you has changed things for me too. Blake's breath caught in his throat. Victoria. Before he could continue, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Blake was on his feet instantly, reaching for the rifle he kept by the door. Stay here, he told Victoria, who had also risen, her hand going to her hip where the wound was still healing. 3 riders approached the house, their forms gradually becoming clearer in the moonlight. Blake raised his rifle, prepared for trouble. That's far enough, he called out when they were within earshot. State your business. The lead rider pulled up, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. Looking for a woman named Victoria Newman, heard in town she might be here. Victoria stepped forward, ignoring Blake's warning glance. I'm Victoria Newman. Who's asking? The rider removed his hat, revealing a weathered face beneath gray streaked hair. Name's Ford, madam. Work for your father. He sent us to find you when you didn't arrive in El Paso as expected. Blake lowered his rifle slightly, but remained alert. How do we know you're really Newman's men? Ford reached slowly into his jacket and pulled out a letter sealed with what Blake recognized as the Newman brand. Mr. Newman gave me this to deliver to his daughter. Victoria stepped forward and took the letter, breaking the seal and reading it quickly by the light spilling from the open doorway. Her expression tightened as she read. It's from my father, she confirmed to Blake. These men are his employees. Blake nodded, lowering his rifle completely but not putting it aside. You're welcome to make camp for the night, he told the men. We can sort everything out in the morning. Ford looked to Victoria for confirmation, a telling gesture that indicated her status. She nodded. Yes, please make camp. We'll depart tomorrow. After the men had ridden a short distance away to set up their camp, Blake turned to Victoria. What did the letter say? Victoria's face was troubled in the dim light. My father is frantic with worry. Apparently, word reached him that I'd been attacked. He's offering a substantial reward for information about the Outlaws. She hesitated. He also says Richard Collins is waiting for me in El Paso, ready to provide comfort in my time of distress. Blake's jaw tightened at the mention of Collins. I see, so you'll be leaving in the morning. Victoria looked down at the letter in her hands, then back up at Blake, conflict evident in her expression. That seems to be the expectation, yes. They stood in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, Blake picked up Victoria's letter from the porch step. I'll tell Hank he doesn't need to deliver this now, he said, his voice carefully even. You should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day for you. Victoria caught his arm as he turned to go inside. Blake, what I was trying to say earlier, it doesn't matter now, he interrupted gently. Your father's men are here. You're going home where you belong. The hurt that flashed across her face made Blake regret his words immediately, but pride kept him from taking them back. Victoria withdrew her hand, her posture stiffening. You're right, of course, she said coolly. Thank you for reminding me of my place, Mr. Reynolds. She brushed past him into the house, leaving Blake alone with the stars and the crushing weight of what might have been. Morning brought a flurry of activity as Victoria prepared to depart with her father's men. Mrs. Garcia had packed food for the journey, and Blake had ensured that Victoria's recovered horse was properly saddled and ready. Victoria herself emerged from the house dressed in a clean riding outfit Mrs. Garcia had altered from one of her own daughter's dresses. Her hair was neatly braided, her face composed in a mask of polite detachment that Blake found far more painful than anger would have been. "I've settled your account with Mrs. Garcia," Victoria informed him as she handed him a small purse. "This is for the medical supplies and food I've consumed during my stay." Blake didn't take the offered money. "That's not necessary. I insist," Victoria said firmly, setting the purse on the porch railing when he still refused to take it. "The Newman family pays its debts." Blake wanted to tell her she owed him nothing, that her presence had been payment enough and more, but the formal distance she'd established between them stopped his words. Instead, he nodded stiffly. Ford approached, leading Victoria's horse. "Ready when you are, Miss Newman." Victoria turned to say goodbye to Mrs. Garcia and Hank, thanking them warmly for their kindness. When she finally faced Blake again, some of her composure cracked, revealing the emotion beneath. "I don't know how to properly thank you for saving my life," she said, her voice softer. "If there's ever anything you need, anything at all, the Newman family will provide it." "I didn't help you for a reward from the Newman family," Blake replied, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from his tone. Victoria flinched slightly. "No, I don't suppose you did." She looked at him directly, her green eyes filled with an emotion Blake couldn't or wouldn't name. "Goodbye, Blake Reynolds." "Goodbye, Miss Newman," he answered formally, though it cost him dearly to do so. "Safe travels." Ford helped Victoria mount her horse, careful of her still healing wounds. Blake watched as she gathered the reins, sitting straight and proud in the saddle despite the pain she must have been feeling. For a moment, he thought she might say something more, but then she turned her horse and rode away, flanked by her father's men. Blake stood watching until they disappeared from sight, the small purse of money still sitting untouched on the porch railing. "You're a damn fool," Hank said bluntly, coming to stand beside him. Blake didn't look at him. "She's Emmett Newman's daughter, going back where she belongs." "Horseshit," Hank spat. "That girl looked at you like you hung the moon, and you let her ride away because you're too proud or too scared to admit you love her." Blake turned sharply. "Love her? I barely know her." "Know her better than most men know the women they marry," Hank countered. "Watched you two these past weeks. Never seen you open up to anyone the way you did with her." Blake had no answer for that. The old ranch hand was right, of course. Somewhere between finding Victoria bleeding in the dirt and watching her ride away, Blake had fallen in love with her strength, her intelligence, her determination, her smile. But love wasn't always enough, especially when it crossed the boundaries of social class and family expectations. "Doesn't matter," Blake said finally. "She's gone." Hank shook his head disgustedly. "And they say women are the cowards when it comes to matters of the heart." As the old man walked away, Blake picked up the purse Victoria had left. The weight of the coins inside felt like a mockery of what he truly wanted from her. With a sudden decision, he strode to the stable and began saddling his horse. "What are you doing?" Hank called, seeing Blake's preparations. "Going to return this money," Blake replied, securing his saddlebags. "It's hers. I won't take payment for helping someone in need." Hank's weathered face split into a knowing grin. "Sure, boss, the money. That's why you're chasing after her." Blake ignored him, mounting his horse and setting off at a gallop in the direction Victoria had taken. He told himself he was just doing the right thing, returning money he hadn't earned. But the urgency driving him had nothing to do with coins and everything to do with the woman who had brought life and light to his solitary existence. The trail was easy to follow, 3 horses heading toward El Paso. Blake pushed his mount hard, knowing Victoria and her escorts had a significant head start. It was mid-afternoon when he finally caught sight of them in the distance, making their way through a narrow canyon. As Blake urged his horse faster, a movement on the canyon ridge caught his attention. Sunlight glinted off something metallic, a rifle barrel. With a surge of alarm, Blake realized Victoria and her escorts were riding into an ambush. "Victoria!" He shouted, though he was still too far away to be heard. "Look out!" The first shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. One of Victoria's escorts fell from his saddle. The second man drew his weapon, but another shot dropped him before he could fire. Victoria's horse reared in panic, nearly unseating her as she struggled to control the frightened animal. Blake drew his revolver as he rode, Spotting 3 men on the ridge, the outlaws who had attacked Victoria before, he was certain. They were focused on their targets below, unaware of his approach from behind. Victoria had managed to control her horse and was reaching for the fallen man's weapon when one of the outlaws took aim at her. Blake fired without hesitation, his shot catching the man in the shoulder and spinning him away from his target. The other 2 turned in surprise, giving Victoria the chance to grab the gun and take cover behind a boulder. Blake charged into the fray, firing again and catching another outlaw in the leg. The 3rd man returned fire, the bullet whizzing past Blake's ear close enough that he felt its passage. Victoria's gun barked from below, her shot going wide but forcing the outlaws to divide their attention. Taking advantage of the distraction, Blake dismounted and rushed the nearest outlaw, tackling him to the ground. They grappled in the dust, the outlaw's greater size nearly overwhelming Blake until Victoria appeared at the top of the ridge, the recovered pistol steady in her hands. "Don't move," she commanded the outlaw Blake was fighting. When the man continued to struggle, she fired a warning shot that kicked up dirt inches from his head. "The next one goes between your eyes." The outlaw froze, and Blake quickly disarmed him, using the man's own belt to bind his hands. The wounded outlaws were similarly secured, their injuries painful but not life-threatening. Only when all 3 were restrained did Blake turn to Victoria, who stood with the gun still raised, her face pale but determined. "Are you all right?" he asked, approaching her slowly. Victoria lowered the weapon, her composure finally cracking. "They killed Ford," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Peters is alive but wounded badly." Blake took the gun gently from her trembling hands. "It's over now, they won't hurt anyone else." Victoria looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. "You followed us." "Why?" Blake reached into his pocket and pulled out the purse she'd left. "To return this. I told you I didn't want payment." For a moment, Victoria just stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed a slightly hysterical sound that held both relief and disbelief. "You rode all this way to return money?" she asked incredulously. "After nearly getting yourself killed, that's your explanation?" Blake shifted uncomfortably under her intense gaze. "Well, it's not the only reason," he admitted. Victoria stepped closer, her green eyes searching his face. "What was the other reason, Blake Reynolds?" The directness of her question, combined with the lingering fear from the gunfight and the relief of finding her alive, broke through Blake's careful restraint. "I couldn't let you go," he said simply. "Not without telling you, without asking if maybe." Words failed him, but Victoria seemed to understand anyway. Her expression softened, hope replacing disbelief. "Without asking if maybe I felt the same way," she finished for him. "If maybe what's grown between us these past weeks is worth fighting for, even with all the complications." Blake nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Yes." Victoria took another step toward him, close enough now that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes, the small scar at the corner of her mouth he'd never noticed before. "I do," she said softly. "Feel the same way." That's why leaving was so difficult. Blake wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms, but the wounded man below and the 3 outlaws watching them held him back. "We should get Peters to a doctor," he said reluctantly, "and turn these men over to the sheriff." Victoria nodded, understanding the practicalities even as her eyes promised a continuation of their conversation later. "El Paso is closest." "El Paso it is," Blake agreed. "And then we can figure out, whatever this is between us." Victoria smiled, a real smile that lit her entire face. "Yes, we can." El Paso in 1877 was a growing frontier town, bustling with commerce from the recently completed railroad and the steady stream of cattle being driven to market. Blake and Victoria arrived with their prisoners, and the wounded Peters just as the sun was setting, the town's buildings casting long shadows across the dusty streets. They went directly to the sheriff's office, where the outlaws were taken into custody and Peters was sent to the doctor. Once statements had been given and arrangements made for Ford's body, Blake and Victoria found themselves standing outside the jailhouse, suddenly alone and uncertain. "I should send word to my father," Victoria said, though she made no move to leave Blake's side. And find somewhere to stay for the night. Blake nodded, acutely aware that they had reached a crossroads. In El Paso, Victoria would return to her world, a world where Blake had no place. The hope they'd shared on the trail seemed suddenly fragile in the face of reality. "There's a decent hotel down the street," he offered, gesturing vaguely. "I can escort you there." Victoria studied him for a moment, then made a decision. "Come with me to telegraph my father first. I want you there when I tell him everything." The telegraph office was still open, the operator a thin man with spectacles who recognized the Newman name immediately. Victoria composed a brief message informing her father of Ford's death, Peter's injury, and the capture of the Outlaws. She hesitated before adding a final line, "Returning home with Blake Reynolds, the man who saved my life. Expect us within the week. Much to discuss." As the operator sent the message, Victoria turned to Blake. "There, now he knows I'm not coming to El Paso and that you're important to me." Blake raised an eyebrow. "Important enough that you're willing to face his disapproval?" Victoria's chin lifted slightly in that determined gesture Blake had come to admire. "Yes, though he may surprise you, my father values courage and character above most things." She took Blake's hand openly, not caring who might see. "Besides, I'm my father's daughter. I make my own decisions." They secured rooms at the hotel, separate ones, propriety still having some claim even in their unusual circumstances, and shared a quiet dinner in the hotel restaurant. Both were exhausted from the day's events, but neither seemed willing to part, each moment together precious after so nearly losing one another. "What happens now?" Blake asked as they lingered over coffee. "You go home to your father and then what?" Victoria considered the question seriously. "I need to explain everything to him in person, not just about us, but about the attack. Those men targeted me specifically because of him. He needs to know why, and us," Blake pressed gently. "Victoria, I have to be honest, I'm not a rich man. My ranch is successful enough, but it's nothing compared to what you're accustomed to." Victoria reached across the table to take his hand. "Do you think I care about that? These past weeks have shown me what truly matters." Her eyes held his steadily. "I've never felt more alive, more myself than I have with you, Blake Reynolds. If that means living in a cabin instead of a mansion, so be it." The sincerity in her voice humbled Blake, but he still had doubts. "Your father might not see it that way." "Then we'll make him understand," Victoria said with characteristic determination. Together. The journey to the Newman ranch took 4 days, during which Blake and Victoria grew even closer. Free from the constraints of his home and the immediacy of her injuries, they discovered new facets of each other. Blake's unexpected talent for storytelling that kept Victoria entertained during long hours in the saddle. Victoria's impressive knowledge of cattle breeding that earned Blake's professional respect. By the time they reached the sprawling Newman ranch, Blake had fallen even deeper in love with Victoria, and his anxiety about meeting her father had grown proportionally. The Newman headquarters was everything Blake had expected, and more, a large, well-built main house surrounded by numerous outbuildings, corrals filled with prime cattle, and dozens of ranch hands going about their work. It was a cattle empire that made Blake's modest sundown ranch look like a child's plaything in comparison. Word of their approach spread quickly. By the time they rode into the main yard, Emmett Newman himself was waiting on the porch, a tall, imposing man with steel-gray hair and Victoria's same green eyes, though his were harder, more calculating. "Victoria," he called, his deep voice carrying across the yard. His gaze moved from his daughter to Blake, assessing and wary. Victoria dismounted without assistance, though Blake noticed she was careful of her still healing hip. She approached her father with confident steps. "Father," she greeted him, accepting his brief embrace. "This is Blake Reynolds, the man who saved my life." Emmett Newman extended his hand to Blake, his grip firm and testing. "Mr. Reynolds, it seems I owe you a debt I can never repay." Blake met the older man's gaze directly. "No debt, sir. I did what anyone would do." Newman's expression suggested he didn't believe that for a moment. "Come inside. Both of you look like you could use a meal and a rest, then you can tell me everything." Over dinner in the Newman dining room, a formal affair that made Blake acutely aware of his plain clothes and trail dust, Victoria recounted the entire story, from the initial attack to Blake's care, to the second confrontation with the Outlaws. She spoke clearly and directly, omitting nothing except the more personal aspects of her time at Sundown Ranch. "So these men targeted you specifically?" Newman asked when she finished, his face grave. "You're certain they mentioned me by name?" Victoria nodded. "The leader said it would teach Emmett Newman a lesson." Those were his exact words. Newman's expression darkened. "I've made enemies over the years, building what I have, but to attack my daughter." He shook his head, then turned to Blake. "You say they're in custody in El Paso?" "Yes, sir," Blake confirmed. "The sheriff was wiring the Texas Rangers when we left. Given the seriousness of the crimes, I expect they'll face the full extent of the law." "Good," Newman said grimly, "though I'd prefer to deal with them personally." Victoria placed a hand on her father's arm. "There's something else we need to discuss, Father." Newman's shrewd eyes moved between his daughter and Blake. "I suspected as much, given your telegraph." Victoria straightened in her chair. "During my recovery, Blake and I developed feelings for each other, serious feelings." Blake held his breath, watching Newman's reaction carefully. The older man's face remained impassive as he studied Blake. "Is that so?" Newman said finally. "And what are your intentions regarding my daughter, Mr. Reynolds?" Before Blake could answer, Victoria interjected. "Father, I'm not a possession to be handed from one man to another. Blake and I are discussing our future together, as equals." Newman raised an eyebrow at his daughter's vehemence, then turned back to Blake. "Nevertheless, I'd like to hear from the man himself." Blake met Newman's gaze steadily. "Sir, I love your daughter. I know I can't offer her the same wealth and comfort you can provide, but I can promise to cherish and respect her, to build a good life together, and to protect her with everything I have." Newman leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Strong words, Mr. Reynolds, but words come easily. What do I know of you beyond my daughter's account? You're a rancher with a small spread near San Elizario, a former Confederate soldier. That tells me little about your character or your ability to make my daughter happy." "Father," Victoria began, her tone warning, but Newman held up a hand. "I'm not finished." He focused on Blake again. "However, actions speak louder than words. You saved Victoria's life at risk to your own. You cared for her when she was injured without expectation of reward. And you pursued her when danger threatened again." A small smile, so like Victoria's that it startled Blake, appeared on the older man's face. "Those actions tell me more about your character than any words could." Relief washed through Blake, though he was careful not to show it. "Thank you, sir." Newman wasn't finished, however. "That said, I won't have my daughter living in reduced circumstances if it can be helped. I propose a partnership." "Partnership," Blake repeated, confused. Newman nodded. "The Newman Ranch needs expansion to the south. Your property would be strategically valuable to us. Instead of buying you out, I suggest incorporating your ranch into our operation, with you managing that section as a full partner." Blake frowned, pride stiffening his spine. "I built the Sundown myself, sir. I'm not looking to sell or be absorbed into a larger operation, even with a partnership offer." Instead of anger at his refusal, Newman's smile widened slightly, as if Blake had passed a test. "Good. I wouldn't respect a man who'd give up what he's built so easily, even for gain." He glanced at Victoria, whose expression had grown concerned. "Relax, daughter. I'm not trying to scare him off. I'm trying to understand the man who's captured your heart." Victoria relaxed slightly, though she still watched her father warily. "And have you reached a conclusion?" Newman studied Blake for a long moment before answering. "I believe Mr. Reynolds is a man of integrity who truly cares for you. Whether he's worthy of you remains to be seen, but I'm willing to give him the opportunity to prove himself." He turned back to Blake. "You have my blessing to court my daughter properly, Mr. Reynolds. The rest is up to the two of you." It wasn't the full acceptance Blake had hoped for, but it was far more than he'd expected. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate your fairness." After dinner, Victoria showed Blake to the guest room where he would be staying. When they were alone in the hallway, she finally allowed herself to relax, leaning against him briefly. "That went better than I feared," she admitted, "though I was prepared to defy him if necessary." Blake tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, marveling that he was free to touch her now. Your father is a shrewd man. He sees more than he lets on. Victoria smiled. He likes you, though he'd never admit it so easily. The fact that he's allowing you to stay here is proof enough. What about Richard Collins? Blake asked, the question that had been troubling him since their arrival. Your father mentioned a partnership, but nothing about breaking your engagement. Victoria's expression grew serious. There is no formal engagement, despite what my father has led Richard to believe, and tomorrow I'll make it absolutely clear to both of them that there never will be. She touched Blake's face gently. My heart belongs to someone else now. The next morning brought a confrontation. Blake had been dreading Richard Collins arrived at the Newman ranch, having apparently been summoned by Emmett Newman before their arrival. Collins was everything. Blake was not expensively dressed, refined in manners, and clearly comfortable in the world of wealth and privilege that the Newmans inhabited. Victoria, my dear, Collins exclaimed upon seeing her, rushing forward to take her hands. When your father told me what happened, I was beside myself with worry. Victoria withdrew her hands from his grasp politely but firmly. I'm quite recovered, Richard, thanks to Mr. Reynolds. She gestured to Blake, who stood nearby, feeling distinctly out of place in the Newmans' elegant sitting room. Collins gave Blake a cursory glance, the kind one might give a servant. Yes, your father mentioned something about a rancher finding you. How fortunate. He turned back to Victoria immediately. You must tell me everything, dear. What a dreadful ordeal for you. Before Victoria could respond, Emmett Newman entered the room, his commanding presence drawing everyone's attention. Richard, I see you've met Blake Reynolds, Newman said, his tone neutral. The man who saved my daughter's life. Collins nodded stiffly. Yes, very heroic, I'm sure. Victoria was just about to tell me the details of her ordeal. Actually, Victoria interjected, her voice firm, I was about to explain that things have changed, Richard. She moved to stand beside Blake, her proximity making her meaning clear. During my recovery, Blake and I developed feelings for each other. Collins looked between them, confusion giving way to disbelief, and then anger. This is absurd. Victoria, you can't possibly be serious. This man is a nobody, a small-time rancher with nothing to offer you. That's where you're wrong, Victoria replied, her chin lifting in that determined gesture Blake had come to love. He's offered me something you never could, the chance to be loved for myself, not for my father's name or fortune. Collins turned to Newman, obviously expecting support. Emmett, surely you don't approve of this. This fortune hunter preying on your daughter's gratitude. Blake tensed, but before he could speak, Newman surprised everyone. I've had the opportunity to observe Mr. Reynolds, Richard. I don't believe gratitude has anything to do with what's between him and Victoria. His gaze moved to his daughter, softening slightly. And I've also observed my daughter. She's happier and more animated than I've seen her in years. Collins sputtered in indignation. You can't be serious. What about our arrangement, the merger of our interests? Business is business, Newman replied coolly. Personal happiness is another matter entirely. If you're still interested in a purely business arrangement, we can discuss that separately. The finality in Newman's tone left no room for argument. Collins looked from Newman to Victoria to Blake, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. This isn't over, he said finally, glaring at Blake. You'll regret this, all of you. With that, he stormed out, the front door slamming behind him. Victoria turned to her father, surprise evident in her expression. I didn't expect you to support me so strongly, Newman sighed, suddenly looking older. Your mother would have my hide if I stood in the way of your happiness, Victoria. She always said you had her spirit too much to be satisfied with a conventional life. He looked at Blake. That doesn't mean I won't hold you to the highest standards, Reynolds. My daughter deserves nothing less. Blake nodded solemnly. I understand, sir, and I agree completely. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The outlaws who had attacked Victoria were tried and convicted, revealing during their testimony that they had been hired by a rival rancher who held a grudge against Emmett Newman for outbidding him on a critical water rights purchase years before. The revelation closed that chapter of danger, allowing Victoria and Blake to focus on their future together. True to his word, Newman did not interfere with their courtship. though he took every opportunity to test Blake's knowledge of ranching, business, and his intentions toward Victoria. For his part, Blake neither backed down nor became defensive. Earning a grudging respect from the older man, Victoria divided her time between the Newman ranch and visits to Sundown, where she and Blake worked side by side to improve the property. She proved to be as knowledgeable about cattle as she had claimed, offering suggestions that Blake implemented with success. Together, they began to envision a future that combined the best of both their worlds. As autumn approached, painting the Texas landscape in gold and russet, Blake took Victoria on a ride to his favorite spot on Sundown Ranch, a small rise overlooking the property, with views stretching to the distant mountains. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land, turning the modest ranch house and outbuildings into silhouettes against the glowing horizon. "I've been thinking," Blake said as they sat side by side on a blanket, watching the sunset, "about what your father said when we first arrived." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Which part?" "He said quite a lot about partnership," Blake clarified. "Not the way he meant it. I still don't want to be absorbed into the Newman operation, but a true partnership between equals." Victoria turned to face him fully. "What kind of partnership did you have in mind?" Blake took her hands in his. "The most important kind, a life partnership." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small ring, a simple gold band set with a single modest diamond. "I can't offer you a mansion or fine things, Victoria. But I can offer you my heart, my hands, and everything I am or ever will be." Victoria's eyes filled with tears as Blake continued, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I love you, Victoria Newman. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me, here at Sundown or wherever our path leads us?" Victoria's smile was radiant as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Blake Reynolds, I will marry you and build a life with you, wherever that may be." As Blake slipped the ring onto her finger, Victoria laughed softly. "My father will have opinions about this, you know," Blake smiled, pulling her close. "I expect nothing less, but this decision is ours alone." To their surprise, Emmett Newman received the news of their engagement with grace and even a touch of warmth. "I've seen how you look at each other," he told them over dinner the evening they announced their plans. "It's how her mother and I looked at each other once upon a time." He raised his glass in a toast. "To Victoria and Blake, may you build something together that lasts beyond yourselves." The wedding took place that December at Sundown Ranch, transformed for the occasion with evergreen boughs and ribbons. Victoria had insisted on the location, wanting to begin their married life in the home Blake had built with his own hands. Emmett Newman spared no expense in ensuring his daughter's wedding was memorable, but respected the couple's wishes to keep the ceremony intimate and meaningful rather than ostentatious. Victoria wore a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, with her mother's pearls at her throat. Blake, in a new suit that fit him perfectly, a gift from Hank and the other ranch hands, watched in awe as she walked toward him on her father's arm. "Who gives this woman to be married?" the minister asked. Emmett Newman's voice was steady, though those who knew him well could detect the emotion beneath. "Her mother and I do." As Victoria took her place beside Blake, she smiled up at him, the same smile that had captivated him months ago, when she first regained consciousness in his bed, the same spirit that had fought against death and convention to find her place beside him. "I love you," she mouthed silently as the minister began the ceremony. "I love you too," Blake replied without sound, his heart fuller than he had ever thought possible. They exchanged vows and rings under the Texas sky, surrounded by friends and family. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Blake kissed Victoria with all the love and promise of their future together, sealing a bond that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances with a wounded woman left for dead, and the cowboy who found her and healed not just her body, but her heart. The celebration lasted well into the night with dancing and feasting and joy. When it was finally time for the guests to depart, Emmett Newman approached the newlyweds with a large envelope. "Your wedding gift," he explained, handing it to them both. "Open it when you're alone." Later, in the privacy of their bedroom, Blake's room, Now transformed with Victoria's feminine touches, they opened the envelope to find deeds and papers. "He's given us the land adjoining Sundown," Victoria said in astonishment as she read through the documents. "And breeding stock from his best bloodlines." Blake examined the papers carefully, not as a takeover but as a genuine gift, with no strings attached. He looked up at Victoria, humbled by her father's generosity. "He's giving us the means to build something truly significant on our own terms." Victoria smiled, setting aside the papers and moving into his arms. "We would have built something significant anyway, with or without the land, but I'm glad he's found a way to show his approval." Blake drew her closer, still amazed that this remarkable woman had chosen him. From wounded stranger to wife in less than 6 months, it's hardly the conventional path to marriage. Victoria laughed, her green eyes sparkling in the lamplight. "When have I ever been conventional, Blake Reynolds? Besides, our story makes for a much more interesting tale to tell our children someday." "Our children," Blake repeated, savoring the words. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," Victoria whispered, reaching up to kiss him. "So do I." 10 years later, Blake stood on the porch of the expanded Sundown Ranch house, watching Victoria teaching their 7-year-old son, James, how to properly approach a young horse. Their 9-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, was already a capable rider, sitting astride her pony nearby and offering advice to her brother with all the authority of her additional 2 years of experience. The sound of an approaching buggy drew Blake's attention. He smiled as he recognized his father-in-law, now showing his age but still formidable in his bearing. Beside him sat Blake and Victoria's youngest child, 5-year-old Thomas, who had clearly been enjoying the special privilege of riding with his grandfather. "Papa." Thomas called out, waving enthusiastically. "Grandpa let me drive the horses, with considerable supervision," Emmett clarified with a wink as he pulled the buggy to a stop. "The boy has a natural hand with the reins, though, takes after his mother." Victoria looked up from her lesson with James, her face breaking into a smile at the sight of her father and youngest son. Though a decade had passed since Blake had found her wounded on that lonely stretch of Texas plain, she was more beautiful to him now than ever, her beauty deepened by the years they'd shared, the children they'd raised, and the life they'd built together. "Is everything ready for the celebration tomorrow?" Emmett asked as he helped Thomas down from the buggy. Blake nodded. "The entire town of San Elizario is buzzing about it. Not every day a ranch celebrates its 15th anniversary with a party for the whole community, and announces its expansion into the largest independent cattle breeding operation in the county," Victoria added, coming to stand beside her husband, slipping her arm through his. "Thanks in no small part to your guidance." Emmett waved away the compliment. "You two did the work." "I just offered advice when asked." His eyes softened as he looked at them. "Your mother would be proud, Victoria, of the family you've built, the business you've grown, and the woman you've become." That evening, after the children were asleep and Emmett had retired to the guest room he maintained for his frequent visits, Blake and Victoria sat on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the Texas sky. The same stars they'd sat under the night Blake had proposed, the same stars that had witnessed their vows and the growth of their family and ranch. "Do you ever think about that day?" Victoria asked softly, her head resting against Blake's shoulder. "When you found me?" Blake's arm tightened around her. "Often, how close I came to losing you before I even knew you." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "The day that changed everything." Victoria looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting the starlight. "I used to wonder why those men attacked me, why I had to suffer through being shot and left for dead." She smiled, tracing the lines of his face with gentle fingers. "Now I know. It was the only way I would find you, find this life that was waiting for me." Blake caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I thanked God every day for leading me to you. I still do." Victoria leaned up to kiss him, a kiss as full of love and promise as their first. When she drew back, her eyes were shining with emotion and certainty. "From wounded stranger to beloved wife," she whispered. "It may not be a conventional love story, Blake Reynolds, but it's ours, and I wouldn't change a single moment of it." As they sat together under the vast Texas sky, surrounded by the ranch they'd built and the legacy they were creating. Blake knew with absolute certainty that finding Victoria that day had been no accident but destiny, the beginning of a love story that would endure long after they were gone. Told and retold by their children and their children's children, a testament to the healing power of love and the unexpected paths that lead us home.